November 7, 1944. Morville-l'Évêque, France. The pencil scratched deliberately across the pages of a field journal belonging to Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann, committing to paper observations that fundamentally contradicted everything the Wehrmacht had been indoctrinated to believe about racial superiority. These Negro tankers demonstrate precision that catches us completely off guard. Their ability to coordinate movements surpasses numerous German units I have personally observed throughout this conflict. Either our intelligence gathering has utterly failed, or we have been systematically fed false information about what these soldiers are capable of accomplishing. Through binoculars held steadily at his eyes, he had just witnessed something profoundly disturbing to Nazi ideology. Black American tankers were operating Sherman tanks with a tactical mastery that rivaled or exceeded battle-hardened Wehrmacht panzer crews, an armored offensive that shattered German defensive lines in barely 4 hours. Back in Germany, the Nazi leadership had hammered into Wehrmacht consciousness a simple doctrine. African soldiers were savages, primitives incapable of comprehending modern warfare, utterly unable to manage sophisticated mechanical systems. Yet here stood the proof of that lie. What Nazi racial theory classified as America's most inferior racial element was commanding 30-ton steel machines with lethal proficiency. 712 men from the 761st Tank Battalion had just entered their first battle. They weren't relegated to support roles or limited assignments. They were spearheading Patton's Third Army offensive into northeastern France with devastating force. The entire German defensive position had been constructed on the assumption of facing inferior troops that would crumble easily. None of them comprehended what was actually unfolding. The beginning of an ideological collapse so complete it would shatter Nazi racial theory to its foundation. Black military excellence was systematically dismantling white supremacist ideology through combat performance and battlefield results. The numbers being written in this moment weren't propaganda on paper, but hard combat statistics that would soon demolish every assumption Wehrmacht soldiers carried about race, capability, and military strength. The path to this November day had started much earlier, on April 1, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The 761st Tank Battalion's activation represented an experiment the United States Army approached with profound skepticism. American military doctrine in 1942 was unambiguous. Black soldiers didn't belong in combat roles. Systemic racism spanning decades had confined African Americans to labor battalions, kitchen duty, and support positions. The 761st existed only because of relentless pressure from black newspapers and civil rights organizations. It was a reluctant concession, not a genuine transformation in military thinking. Among the soldiers who arrived at Camp Claiborne was Reuben Rivers, 23 years old, born in Okfuskee, Oklahoma, and raised in Muskogee. Part Cherokee, part black, Rivers had worked family farmland and later on the railway before his draft notice came in January 1942. His personnel file highlighted something remarkable, an unusual blend of mechanical skill and innate leadership ability. Also arriving were Leonard Smith from New York, William McBurney from Pennsylvania, and Preston McNeil from Texas. Men from across Black America, brought together by warfare and a military system that demanded their service while segregating their lives. The battalion's commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, a white officer. Unlike most in the Army hierarchy, Bates genuinely believed in his men's potential. He understood what others refused to accept. Given proper training and quality equipment, black soldiers would perform as capably as any troops anywhere in the world. His real battle wasn't against enemy forces, but against the prejudices embedded throughout his own military. Bates implemented a training program deliberately designed to be grueling. The 761st trained with greater intensity and longer hours than white armor units received. They had no choice. Any single mistake would become evidence of racial inferiority in the minds of skeptical superior officers. Each failure would reinforce every prejudice held by command. The pressure was crushing, yet it forged extraordinary bonds. The men learned to operate the M5 Stuart light tank at Camp Claiborne. The Stuart carried a 37mm gun and 30 caliber machine guns. It reached speeds of 36 miles per hour, despite light armor protection. Under Louisiana's oppressive heat, tankers practiced coordinating movements, perfecting communication systems, and mastering fire control protocols. They studied gunnery extensively, learning to identify distant targets and engage them accurately while the vehicle moved. They learned every aspect of maintenance, repairing tracks, replacing road wheels, servicing engines under field conditions without proper facilities. They mastered radio procedure, the precise language that coordinates tanks across a battlefield. The training wore them down relentlessly. Tank interiors in Louisiana summer became ovens approaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Practice sessions continued until coordination became automatic. A driver, gunner, loader, and commander needed to function as a unified system. Commander's orders had to be executed instantly, without hesitation. Gunners had to maintain accuracy despite constant vehicle movement. Loaders fed shells continuously without pause. Drivers navigated terrain while managing engine performance and fuel consumption. They became exceptionally skilled. By August 1942, when the battalion transferred to Camp Livingston for major maneuvers, their proficiency ratings matched veteran white armored units. Observers noted their discipline, mechanical expertise, and tactical understanding. In simulated combat against other units, they performed impressively. Their maintenance documentation was exceptional. Their gunnery scores were consistently high. By every objective standard, they were prepared for combat. But excellence produced no deployment orders. White tank battalions shipped to North Africa, Italy, and eventually France, while the 761st remained stateside. The pattern became unmistakable. The army would train black tankers, but wouldn't commit them to actual fighting. The stated reasons shifted constantly. Some commanders claimed insufficient black support personnel to sustain a black tank battalion in combat. Others contended white infantry wouldn't accept black tank support. Still others maintained this was an experiment requiring extensive observation before field deployment. The underlying reason was straightforward. The army simply didn't believe black soldiers could fight effectively. This conviction, rooted entirely in racial prejudice, rather than evidence, kept the 761st locked in endless training while the war continued overseas. Month followed month of training. In April 1943, they participated in Third Army maneuvers at Camp Polk. These large-scale exercises involved thousands of troops simulating combat conditions across hundreds of square miles. Once again, they performed admirably. Once again, they received no orders. The frustration was caustic. These were men who had volunteered or been drafted to fight fascism, trapped in an unending training cycle because of skin color. The irony was apparent to everyone. They were preparing to fight Nazi racial ideology while enduring American racial prejudice. The bitter paradox intensified at Fort Hood, Texas, beginning in September 1943. The 761st received an upgrade to M4 Sherman medium tanks. The Sherman mounted a 75mm main gun, later upgraded to 76mm. It offered superior armor, better crew protection, and sufficient firepower to engage German tanks. Weighing approximately 30 tons, it required a 5-man crew. The Sherman became the principal tank of American armored forces, manufactured in greater numbers than any other American tank throughout the war. The men dedicated themselves to mastering this new equipment. The Sherman exceeded the Stuart in complexity. Larger, heavier, far more powerful. It demanded different handling techniques. They learned to manage its wider turning radius, greater fuel consumption, and more advanced fire control systems. They practiced main gun firing, coordinated with infantry units, and executed complex tactical movements. Their proficiency developed quickly. Every training report showed their enthusiasm for finally receiving combat-capable equipment. But Fort Hood sat within Jim Crow, Texas. The contradiction between their mission and their treatment became unbearable. They trained to fight for freedom and democracy while experiencing neither. Off-duty, black soldiers encountered segregated facilities everywhere. Separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, separate waiting rooms. Restaurants refused service. Businesses turned them away. Local police harassed them constantly. White civilians treated them with open contempt. On base, conditions were marginally better at best. Black and white soldiers trained separately, slept in separate barracks. Even the post-exchange and theater were segregated. Black soldiers who had earned the right to wear the United States Army uniform were denied basic human dignity because of their complexion. One incident captured this contradiction perfectly. Second Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson, an outstanding athlete who would later become baseball's color barrier breaker, refused to move to the back of a bus on Fort Hood Base in July 1944. Lieutenant Colonel Bates supported him. Senior officers intervened regardless, transferred Robinson to another unit, and initiated court-martial proceedings. Robinson was eventually acquitted, but deployment with the 761st was now impossible. The message was unmistakable. Black soldiers, regardless of capability, would remain second-class citizens. The deployment order finally arrived in June 1944. After 2.5 years of training, the 761st Tank Battalion received orders for overseas movement. The men could scarcely believe it. The European War had raged for nearly 5 years. D-Day had occurred on June 6th. Allied forces were establishing themselves in France. The need for armored units was desperate. Finally, the 761st would demonstrate what they had been asserting all along. They were ready. On August 27, 1944, they boarded the troopship Esperance Bay in New York Harbor. 1,112 men, along with personal equipment, prepared for the Atlantic crossing. Their tanks would be issued in England. They brought everything else: weapons, tools, spare parts, personal gear. The organized pandemonium of embarkation filled the docks as units loaded supplies and materials. The Esperance Bay was a British vessel, one of hundreds moving men and supplies across the Atlantic to sustain European warfare. Accommodations were cramped. Soldiers occupied bunks, stacked 4 high in spaces converted from cargo holds. Meals came in shifts. Space was precious. The men's spirits remained high regardless. After years of waiting, they were finally heading to war. The 10-day voyage to England gave them time to consider what awaited them. They would become the first black armored unit to see combat in the European theater. Other black units had fought previously. The 92nd Infantry Division had seen combat in Italy. Separate black artillery battalions had supported white infantry divisions. Yet no black tank battalion had previously entered European combat. The 761st would be first. The responsibility weighed heavily. Every action would be examined carefully. Every mistake would be magnified. Success would challenge racial assumptions. Failure would confirm them. Upon arrival in England, the 761st received the latest Sherman variant, the M4A3, equipped with the upgraded 76mm gun. This represented a significant advance over the 75mm gun used in Texas training. The 76mm offered greater armor penetration capability, allowing engagement with German Panthers and Tigers more effectively. The longer gun barrel and improved ammunition gave American tankers superior capability against heavier German armor they would encounter in combat. The M4A3 also featured a more powerful engine, the Ford GAA V8, producing 450 horsepower. This power plant gave the Sherman better acceleration and hill-climbing capability than previous models. The enhanced power made the 30-ton tank more responsive in battle, allowing rapid maneuvering and terrain exploitation. These improvements mattered critically. In tank warfare, speed and firepower frequently determined survival. They trained briefly on British soil, mastering upgraded vehicles, conducting gunnery practice, running tactical exercises. Training was compressed and intense. They had only weeks before shipping to France. British training areas in southern England resonated with tank engines and gunfire as American units readied for combat. The 761st trained alongside white American units and British armored formations. Some white American soldiers showed surprise encountering black tankers. British soldiers, less influenced by American racial prejudice, simply treated them as fellow combatants. Then they shipped to France. The English Channel crossing was rough. Tank crews, many experiencing their first sea voyage, struggled with seasickness as landing craft rose and fell in Channel waters. They made it across. On October the 10th, 1944, they landed at Omaha Beach, 4 months after D-Day. The secure beachhead still held remnants of battle, damaged equipment, shattered fortifications, and the haunting atmosphere of ground purchased with blood. The 761st moved quickly inland via rail and road toward the front lines. On October 28, 1944, they reached their assembly area near the French-German border. General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army, had specifically requested the 761st for his push toward the Siegfried Line. Patton was recognized for aggressive armored warfare tactics and controversial personality. He also held complicated views about race. He had served with Buffalo Soldiers early in his career and respected their fighting capability. Yet he harbored the prejudices common to his generation and social standing. When Patton addressed the 761st on October 28, his speech was characteristically direct. "Now, you are the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you were not good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I do not care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those goddamned sons of bitches. Everybody has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Do not let them down, and goddamn you, do not let me down." The speech reflected Patton's character, mixing profanity, motivation, and acknowledgement of racial dynamics. The 761st understood the subtext clearly. They were on trial. Their performance would be judged not merely as soldiers, but as representatives of their entire race. The pressure was enormous, but they had trained for this moment across 30 months. On November 7, 1944, the 761st Tank Battalion entered combat. Their first objective was the German-held town of Morville-l'Évêque in northeastern France. The town straddled a crucial road junction the Germans had heavily fortified. Previous American attacks had failed to break the German grip. The 761st was attached to the 26th Infantry Division and ordered to break the deadlock. Captain John Long of B Company led the assault. Long was a tough Detroit officer who had earned his men's confidence through tactical skill and personal bravery. Behind him, Sergeant Roy King commanded the lead Sherman. The attack began at dawn. As King's tank entered Morville-l'Évêque, a German soldier with a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket fired from a nearby building. The shaped charge hit the Sherman's side, disabling the tank and wounding 2 crew members. The situation became critical. The disabled tank blocked the narrow street. German defenders were concentrating fire on the position. King and his crew extracted the wounded men to cover behind their vehicle. Using rifles and the tank's remaining weapons, they killed the Panzerfaust operator and the crew of a nearby German anti-tank gun. The rest of B Company pushed into the town. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers encountered a German roadblock, a felled tree reinforced with mines blocking the way forward. German mortars and rifles had pinned the supporting infantry in exposed positions. The entire offensive threatened collapse. Without hesitation, Rivers dismounted his tank, exposed to direct fire. He attached a tow cable to the roadblock and climbed back into his Sherman. His tank dragged the obstacle clear, allowing the column to advance and infantry to break free. Rivers received the Silver Star for this action. By day's end on November 7th, the 761st had taken Morville-l'Évêque. The Germans had resisted fiercely, but the Black Panthers, as the battalion nicknamed themselves after their insignia, had prevailed. The cost was substantial. Sergeant Roy King died from his wounds. Other casualties accumulated, but the 761st had proven they could fight. They had demonstrated something far more powerful than battlefield victory. They had proven they could win. When German soldiers were captured at Morville-l'Évêque, they revealed something the Nazi propaganda machine had not prepared them for: genuine shock and confusion. Their commanding officers had filled their heads with certainty. Black American soldiers, they were told, lacked proper training. They were poorly organized. They would collapse the moment real pressure came. Instead, what these German prisoners encountered was nothing like the narrative they'd been fed. They faced a well-orchestrated unit of armored infantry, moving with genuine precision, fighting with unmistakable determination. One captured German officer made a striking comparison. He said Sergeant King's performance reminded him of a Russian tank crew in the exact same situation, acknowledging the tactical competence right there in front of him. The 761st kept moving forward. November 8th brought fighting at Vix-Orsay. The next day, they assaulted Château-Salins following a grueling 4-hour battle. By November 10, they had captured Durez. What emerged was an undeniable pattern. The Black Panthers fought with effectiveness. They responded to changing conditions on the battlefield. They took their objectives. The Germans at Vix-Orsay had prepared strong defensive positions that had already turned back other attacks. The town sat up on elevated terrain, giving the defenders commanding views of everything below them. German anti-tank guns commanded the approach roads, positioned to stop anything coming up those slopes. Machine gun emplacements controlled the main intersections. The 761st adapted. They coordinated closely with infantry. Smoke billowed across the landscape, obscuring German sightlines. Tank guns thundered, suppressing defensive positions while the infantrymen advanced beneath that protective cover. The town fell with remarkably light casualties, accomplished through superior tactics and seamless cooperation. Château-Salins presented a tougher proposition. The Germans there had prepared something more resilient. Stone buildings had been fortified into strongpoints that dominated the town center. The Sherman tank guns went to work methodically, reducing each position while infantry cleared the surrounding structures room by room. The 4-hour engagement showed something critical about the battalion. They were growing stronger with each fight. They learned, they adapted, they improved. The men themselves felt the difference. They were astonished by how effectively they functioned under fire. Years in training school had given them the technical skills, but actual combat revealed something deeper about character. Fear gripped everyone out there, but somehow they functioned anyway. The roar of weapons, the acrid smell of cordite hanging in the air, the sight of fallen comrades, the overwhelming chaos of battle itself. Through training and solid leadership, it became manageable. Tank commanders stayed calm, making decisions while rounds whistled overhead. Crews followed orders even when danger was immediate. The battalion functioned precisely as it had been designed to function. Sergeant Warren Cressy's story became the stuff of legend. When anti-tank fire destroyed his Sherman, Cressy bailed out. He grabbed a machine gun from a nearby half-track and turned it on the German crew that had knocked him out. Not satisfied, he jumped onto another tank and kept fighting. His bravery earned him a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. His combat record across the whole campaign was extraordinary. He stayed at the front continuously, showing tactical brilliance and personal courage that earned genuine respect from every soldier who saw him in action. Other tank commanders who fought alongside him described his composure under fire, his talent for making split-second tactical calls, his readiness to put himself in harm's way to complete the mission. His qualities appeared across the battalion in dozens of men. These characteristics defined who the unit was. The 761st was not simply one or two exceptional individuals. It was an entire battalion of trained soldiers, motivated and genuinely capable, who performed their duties against the most brutal circumstances imaginable. Every tank crew worked effectively. Every platoon executed orders with professionalism. Collectively, the battalion met its objectives repeatedly against serious opposition. This kind of shared excellence gave the unit's accomplishments real meaning. It demonstrated that black soldiers as a whole, not merely a select few remarkable individuals, could perform at the same level as any troops in actual combat. But the most striking story from the 761st's early fighting belonged to Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. On November 16th, Rivers was directing a company's advance toward Gebeling when his Sherman ran over a mine at a railway crossing. The explosion tore through the tank's underbelly and sent shrapnel spraying through the crew compartment. Rivers took the brunt of it. Metal fragments slashed open his leg from knee to thigh, cutting clear down to bone. The injury was severe, demanding immediate medical evacuation. Captain David Williams, commanding the company, reached Rivers' position with medical support. They carried morphine to dull the worst of the pain before transport. Williams remembered what Rivers said. "Reuben, you're going back. You got yourself $1 million wound. That's your ticket home." Rivers said no. He rejected morphine because it would fog his mind. He refused evacuation because his men still needed him. The medics bandaged the wound as best they could, but Rivers could see German artillery spotters marking their position. He pulled himself into another Sherman and took command. Through the night of November 16th, Rivers stayed with the company as they prepared to assault Gebling. When dawn broke on November 17th, his leg had swollen grotesquely. Infection was taking hold. Gangrene was beginning to set in. Moving caused him visible, excruciating pain. Captain Williams ordered evacuation again. Rivers refused again. "Captain, you know how this works. This one's going to be rough." Rivers led the assault into Gebling himself. His tank crew said later that he directed their fire through clenched teeth, sweat running down his face from agony and fever. The Germans defended Gebling with fierce determination. The 761st lost 3 tanks to anti-tank fire and another to mines just taking the town. Rivers' Sherman engaged enemy positions throughout the day, eliminating machine gun positions and suppressing German infantry. Through November 17th and 18th, Rivers remained commanding his tank. His condition worsened rapidly. The infection was spreading through his body. Medical officers examining him in the field were appalled that he continued fighting. By the morning of November 19th, Rivers was plainly dying. His leg had turned black with gangrene. Fever consumed him. Yet when a company received orders to advance toward Borgel-Troth, Rivers refused to stay behind. At dawn, the company moved out from Gebling. Within minutes, heavy anti-tank fire erupted from concealed German positions. Captain Williams ordered his tanks to withdraw to cover. Rivers radioed back. He had found the enemy anti-tank guns. He and another Sherman would move forward to engage, covering the company's withdrawal. The German guns concentrated everything on those 2 exposed American tanks. Armor-piercing rounds struck Rivers' Sherman over and over. One punched through the turret. The tank erupted in flame. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers died instantly. 2 more crew members were killed. The remaining crew was wounded. Rivers had fought for 3 days, carrying a wound that should have killed him on day 1. His leadership and final sacrifice had allowed a company to capture 2 heavily fortified towns and inflict serious casualties on German forces. For his actions between November the 16th and 19th, Rivers would receive the Medal of Honor, though recognition came terribly late, in January 1997, 53 years after his death. The 761st continued fighting. There was no space for grief. The war demanded constant forward momentum. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its final major offensive in the West. The Battle of the Bulge caught Allied forces flat-footed, creating a dangerous bulge in American lines and threatening Antwerp. The 761st was rushed north to help seal the German breakthrough. They were attached to the 87th Infantry Division and committed immediately to fighting for the Belgian town of Tilt. The movement north was absolute chaos. Allied forces were scrambling to respond to this sudden German offensive. Roads were congested with retreating units, panicked refugees, and supply columns backed up for miles. The 761st pushed through this mayhem, reaching their assembly area on January 6, 1945. They went into immediate combat. The battle for Tilt became one of the fiercest engagements the Black Panthers faced. German SS panzer troops held the town with fanatical intensity. These were elite formations, battle-hardened soldiers with Eastern Front experience who understood how to fight tanks. They had prepared Tilt meticulously, placing anti-tank guns to cover every approach route, laying mines across the roads, fortifying buildings into defensive positions. They intended to hold. Winter added brutal conditions to every moment of the fight. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Snow piled up several feet deep in many areas. Blowing snow cut visibility to mere meters. The cold was savage. Tank engines struggled to turn over. Hydraulic systems froze solid. Ammunition had to be warmed before firing, or it would jam. Crews wore every piece of clothing they could find, but still suffered terribly from the cold. The Sherman's narrow tracks gave them problems in these conditions. On frozen earth and ice, the tanks slipped and skidded. Drivers fought constantly to maintain control on even slight slopes. Those narrow tracks distributed 30 tons of weight across a smaller surface area than wider tracks would have, which meant reduced grip on ice and snow. Movements that would have been simple during summer became genuinely treacherous in winter. During the tilt operation, the 761st encountered something unprecedented: psychological warfare directed specifically at them as black soldiers. German radio broadcasts, delivered by an American-born propagandist named Mildred Gillars, known as Axis Sally, cut into American communications. "Good morning, Negro soldiers of the 761st. I am sorry that you will die today in tilt. Our fight is not with you, and your fight is not with us. Your fellow Negroes are rioting in Cleveland. Your commander, Captain Williams, is leading you to death. He is white and not one of you. Your battalion commander, Major George, is also white and not one of you. Leave your tanks now and return home to Cleveland, where you are needed and you will not be killed." The broadcast carried music, specifically Louis Armstrong singing, "I cannot give you anything but love, baby." The propaganda effort was sophisticated, engineered to exploit racial divisions and persuade black soldiers they were dying for a white man's war. It failed completely. The men of the 761st understood exactly what they were fighting for. Not merely against Nazi Germany, but against the racial ideology that Axis Sally's very broadcast represented. Tank Commander Frank Cochrane's response, radioed to his company, became legendary. "They have hit me 3 times, but I am still giving them hell." The 761st captured Tilt after days of brutal close-quarters fighting. When German defenders surrendered, they discovered that black soldiers had beaten them. Many German soldiers had absorbed Nazi propaganda so thoroughly that meeting skilled black tankers created genuine cognitive dissonance. How could an inferior race defeat superior German troops? German prisoners captured by the 761st often showed visible shock and fear. One prisoner at Tilt asked plainly, "What are you doing here? This is a white man's war." The answer, obvious to everyone except dedicated believers in racial pseudoscience, was that Nazi racial ideology was simply false. Nazi propaganda about black soldiers' inferiority was pervasive and extensively documented. The regime had conducted campaigns depicting black people as subhumans since the 1920s, long before war even began. These campaigns served multiple purposes. They reinforced Nazi racial theories domestically, they prepared German soldiers to regard enemies as inferior, and they attempted to fracture the Allied coalition by exploiting existing racial tensions. The regime had spent years constructing these beliefs. Hitler's Mein Kampf, written in 1925 and 1926, contained explicit statements about contamination of the white race through contact with black people. The text argued that racial mixing would lead to civilization's decline. These were not marginal beliefs, but core Nazi doctrine, taught in schools, broadcast in propaganda, enforced through law. The Nuremberg laws of 1935, primarily remembered for targeting Jews, also applied to black people in Germany. People of African descent were classified as racially alien and faced legal discrimination, social exclusion, and eventually violent persecution. Roughly 500 Afro-Germans living in Germany were forcibly sterilized under Nazi racial hygiene programs between 1937 and 1945. The intent was to prevent what the regime called racial contamination. During the war, the German military distributed propaganda leaflets to black American soldiers in November 1944, attempting to convince them they fought for a nation that oppressed them. These leaflets, examples preserved in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, depicted American lynching and racial discrimination. They asked why black soldiers fought for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. The psychological campaign was sophisticated but ultimately ineffective because it underestimated black soldiers' understanding of what they opposed. Nazi cartoons portrayed black soldiers as primitives incapable of modern warfare. German propaganda magazines published illustrations of black American troops as savage, subhuman figures threatening civilization. These images drew from centuries of racist stereotypes amplified by Nazi ideology. Wehrmacht soldiers encountered this propaganda throughout training and service. Many accepted it completely. The Black Horror on the Rhine propaganda campaign had portrayed African soldiers serving in the French army during World War I as savages committing atrocities against German civilians. Though largely fabricated, these claims were widely believed in Germany, and formed part of the narrative German soldiers carried into World War II. Wehrmacht training materials reinforced these beliefs, conditioning German soldiers for what they were told would be encounters with inferior opponents. German military intelligence consistently underestimated Black American units, predicting they would fold under pressure and perform poorly. These assessments reflected ideological bias rather than genuine analysis. When reality contradicted these predictions, many German soldiers experienced cognitive dissonance that started to erode their faith in Nazi ideology. The actual performance proved completely different. The 761st continued operations through winter 1944 and into 1945. They fought through the Rhine campaign, reaching the Siegfried Line in March 1945. This accomplishment held special significance. The Siegfried Line, called the West Wall by Germans, consisted of fortifications stretching along Germany's western border. The defensive system extended nearly 400 miles from the Netherlands to Switzerland. It contained more than 18,000 bunkers, tunnels, and tank obstacles. Concrete installations housed anti-tank guns and machine guns with overlapping fields of fire. Dragon's teeth, pyramid-shaped concrete barriers, blocked tank movement, while minefields covered every approach. The Germans had invested years building these fortifications and viewed them as nearly impenetrable. Breaking through required coordinated attacks combining infantry and tanks against prepared positions held by experienced German troops now defending their own soil. The 761st participated in multiple assaults on Siegfried Line positions. Each attack demanded careful planning. Engineers removed mines and demolished obstacles, while tanks provided covering fire. Infantry advanced closely alongside armor, each supporting the other. Artillery suppressed German defensive positions, while tanks and infantry maneuvered into assault positions. These were methodical, deliberate attacks against fortified defenses requiring patience, coordination, and considerable courage. During March 20 to 23, 1945, the 761st achieved one of its most impressive victories. In this four-day operation, breaking through fortified Siegfried Line positions near Rheine-Durkheim, they inflicted approximately 4,000 enemy casualties, both killed and wounded, and captured 3,200 prisoners. German units defending this sector included Luftwaffe Field Division elements, Volkssturm militia, and regular Wehrmacht infantry. The breakthrough allowed Allied forces to push deeper into Germany, shattering German defensive lines and hastening the war's conclusion. This single operation demonstrated how completely the battalion had evolved. The unit that entered combat in November as relative newcomers had become a veteran formation, executing complex combined arms operations against serious opposition. Their success proved that skill, training, and leadership transcended race. The 761st performed this mission repeatedly. Their tactics became increasingly sophisticated with experience. They learned to coordinate fire that suppressed German anti-tank guns effectively. They developed methods for clearing towns and fortified positions. They became specialists at combined arms warfare, integrating their armor with infantry, artillery, and air support. By late March 1945, the Black Panthers ranked among the most experienced armored units in Patton's Third Army. German prisoners captured by the 761st received treatment according to the Geneva Convention, handled with professionalism and genuine humanity. This behavior, so contrary to what German soldiers had been taught to expect from black troops, created another opening in Nazi ideology. If the Nazis had lied about black soldiers being murderous primitives, what else had they deceived people about? Some German prisoners would later speak of a moment that shook them to their core. When they were captured by black American troops, the carefully constructed propaganda they'd been fed began to crumble. Everything the Third Reich had drilled into them suddenly seemed hollow. By the end of March 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion had crossed the Rhine River and thrust far into German territory. This crossing represented one of the war's pivotal operations. For decades, the Rhine had stood as Germany's most formidable natural defensive line in the West. Once Allied forces pushed across, nothing could stop the advance toward Germany's industrial centers. The 761st moved as part of an enormous surge of soldiers, tanks, trucks, and equipment pouring over the river. Engineers had built pontoon bridges to span the water. Traffic controllers stood at checkpoints, directing the endless stream of vehicles. Everything moved with precision, and discipline, a stark display of Allied organizational power that stood in sharp contrast to the chaos engulfing the German army. Over the following weeks, the battalion helped encircle enormous German forces in the Ruhr pocket. Hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht and SS troops found themselves trapped, cut off from escape. This operation essentially shattered Germany's ability to mount any serious defense in the western half of the country. The Ruhr wasn't just any territory, it was Germany's industrial lifeblood. Factories there produced weapons, ammunition, supplies, everything an army needs to fight. Once those factories fell out of reach, German forces faced an impossible situation. They tried breaking out of the encirclement, desperate and determined, but their attempts failed repeatedly. Allied forces gradually tightened the noose, moving methodically to crush any remaining organized resistance. The 761st's role was to maintain relentless pressure. Whenever German troops tried to retreat and establish new defensive positions, the battalion was there to stop them. They conducted rapid pursuit operations, keeping enemy units constantly off balance and unable to reform their lines. They encountered German forces trying desperately to withdraw, fought sharp engagements in small towns, captured villages whose defenders hadn't yet received orders to pull back. The pace was grueling, pushing men and machines to the limit. But there was also something exhilarating about chasing a broken enemy after months of grinding, brutal combat against prepared defenses. Towns blurred together in the reports filed afterward. Agricultural villages, industrial suburbs, each one requiring the same procedure. Clear the streets, suppress any resistance with tank fire, send the infantry in to check buildings and round up prisoners, move to the next objective. The cycle repeated endlessly. Hundreds of German vehicles fell into Allied hands or were destroyed. Trucks abandoned by fleeing units littered the roads, staff cars whose officers had fled on foot. Half-tracks immobilized by empty fuel tanks. Artillery pieces left behind. Some were destroyed by gunfire, others were simply disabled to prevent any future use. The German landscape in April 1945 told a story of complete collapse, the roads scattered with the debris of a dying army. Through it all, the battalion maintained its combat readiness despite the constant strain. Tank maintenance became almost sacred work. Tracks wore out from the continuous miles. Engines needed constant service. Guns required cleaning and adjustment. Ammunition had to be loaded and organized. Fuel was always scarce and had to be found wherever possible. The maintenance crews and supply personnel worked in obscurity, rarely earning any recognition. Yet without them, the combat crews simply could not have functioned. These mechanics and supply soldiers performed extraordinary feats, working through the night, sometimes under fire, replacing damaged components, repairing broken systems, keeping the Shermans moving forward. Some tanks that should have been pulled back for major repairs were kept operational through sheer determination and clever improvisation. Crews cannibalized disabled tanks for usable parts. They fabricated repairs from whatever materials they could scrounge. They did whatever needed doing to keep their vehicles in combat. Tank commanders also had to adapt to significant personnel changes. The battalion's composition had shifted dramatically by April 1945. Combat losses and other casualties had created constant turnover. Replacement soldiers arrived with minimal training, many straight from stateside camps, with zero combat experience. They had to learn fast. Veteran crew members took on the responsibility of teaching them. Tank commanders integrated these new soldiers into their crews, and the unit absorbed them, maintaining its fighting ability through strong leadership. Officers from Lieutenant Colonel Bates on down through every company and platoon commander held the unit together through sheer force of will and professional competence. In late April 1945, the 761st received orders to push toward Austria. They became among the first American units to make contact with Soviet forces advancing from the east. On April 26, 1945, tanks of the 761st met Soviet armor near Stadel, Austria. The moment carried profound symbolic weight. Allied forces from the west and east had split Germany in two. The Third Reich was finished. The men of the 761st found the encounter with Soviet soldiers deeply memorable. Soviet tank crews included women. Leonard Smith, who served as a gunner in the 761st, never forgot being embraced by a Russian woman tank crew member who kept shouting "America," nearly knocking the wind from him with her enthusiasm. These brief cultural exchanges carried real meaning. Soldiers who had traveled thousands of miles to destroy fascism shared a moment of genuine triumph. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day arrived. The war in Europe officially ended. The 761st Tank Battalion had been in continuous combat for 183 days straight. No other American armored unit in the European theater had fought for so long without being relieved or rotated. This extraordinary achievement received official recognition through a presidential unit citation signed by President Jimmy Carter in 1978. The numbers told a remarkable story. The battalion participated in 4 major Allied campaigns: the Northern France Campaign, the Rhineland Campaign, the Ardennes-Alsace Campaign, the Central Europe Campaign. They fought across 6 countries: France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. They liberated or captured more than 30 towns. Over those 183 consecutive days, they inflicted approximately 130,000 casualties on German forces through direct combat, artillery coordination, and combined operations with infantry divisions. The cost was significant. 3 officers and 31 enlisted men of the 761st were killed in action. 22 officers and 180 enlisted men were wounded. The battalion also suffered 44 non-battle casualties in November 1944 alone: injuries, illnesses, and combat fatigue. When accounting for all replacements received and lost over 183 days of continuous combat, the overall casualty rate approached 50%, as documented in the Presidential Unit Citation. For their service, battalion members received 11 Silver Stars, 69 Bronze Stars, and approximately 300 Purple Hearts. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers received the Medal of Honor after his death, awarded posthumously in 1997 when President Bill Clinton presented the decoration on January 13th of that year. President Jimmy Carter had awarded the 761st Tank Battalion the Presidential Unit Citation in 1978, with the citation made official on April 10th of that year, recognizing their extraordinary heroism and performance. Yet the true significance of the 761st extended beyond what statistics could measure. Their combat effectiveness fundamentally challenged the racial assumptions that had shaped American military thinking for decades. They had demonstrated conclusively that black soldiers, given proper training, equipment, and leadership, performed as capably as any troops in the entire army. This evidence would prove crucial to the political and military struggle to desegregate the American armed forces. The journey home carried both joy and bitterness for the 761st's men. They had fought with courage for their country, defeating an enemy dedicated to racial supremacy. They expected recognition, respect, and gratitude. What many encountered instead was rekindled discrimination. The men of the 761st returned to a segregated America. They were turned away from certain restaurants. Hotels refused to accommodate them. Neighborhoods remained closed to them. Men who had commanded tanks in combat found themselves steered toward menial labor. Heroes wearing silver stars encountered casual racism from civilians who had never seen combat or left their hometowns. The contradiction was painful and radicalizing. These men had risked their lives for America. They had demonstrated their capabilities under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Yet they still faced second-class citizenship. This experience, shared by thousands of black veterans returning from World War II, fueled the emerging civil rights movement. If America could demand that black citizens fight and die for freedom abroad, how could it possibly justify denying them freedom at home? The logic became irrefutable. Black veterans had shown courage, competence, and sacrifice equal to any American soldiers. Denying them equal rights while celebrating their victories exposed the moral bankruptcy of segregation. The political pressure mounted relentlessly. The NAACP used the combat records of units like the 761st as evidence in their equality campaigns. Black newspapers published accounts of battlefield heroism alongside stories of discrimination at home. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. Veterans testified before Congress about fighting fascism abroad while facing discrimination at home. Their testimony carried weight that academic arguments never could. They had bled for America. They had proven themselves under fire. They demanded recognition. White veterans also contributed to this transformation. Many soldiers who had served alongside black support troops or who had been supported by black tank battalions in combat returned home with fundamentally altered perspectives. They had witnessed black soldiers fight and die. They had been saved by black tankers. Their testimony challenged deeply held assumptions among those who had never served. Military commanders, including some who had initially opposed black combat troops, submitted official reports documenting the battalion's effectiveness. The evidence became overwhelming. President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, mandating desegregation of the United States Armed Forces. The order established the need for equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race. Truman acted from both moral conviction and political calculation. The combat record of units like the 761st provided the empirical justification he needed. The order encountered substantial resistance. Some military leaders argued that integrated units would damage combat effectiveness. Some Southern politicians threatened political consequences. Some officers resigned rather than command integrated units. But the order endured. Implementation proceeded gradually, taking several years to complete fully, but the principle was established. Race would no longer dictate military assignments or opportunities. Military studies conducted during the Korean War, including the Project Clear study conducted between 1949 and 1951, examined integrated and segregated units in combat. The findings confirmed what the 761st had already proven. Race held no correlation with combat effectiveness. Training mattered. Leadership mattered. Unit cohesion mattered. Skin color did not. The 761st's legacy extended far beyond military policy. Members of the battalion became educators, business leaders, and civil rights activists. They carried forward the knowledge that they had proven something fundamental about human potential. When given equal opportunity, Black Americans achieved at the highest levels. This knowledge, born in combat, shaped the remainder of their lives. They returned to communities across America, carrying not just military experience, but a transformed understanding of their own capabilities and their rights as citizens. They had commanded complex machines in battle. They had made life-and-death decisions under intense pressure. They had proven themselves equal to any soldiers in the world. This experience made them unwilling to accept second-class citizenship quietly. They became activists, educators, and community leaders who demanded the equality they had earned through service. Many pursued higher education using the GI Bill. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 provided educational benefits to veterans. For many Black veterans, this represented their first genuine opportunity for college education. They attended historically Black colleges and universities across the South. They enrolled in integrated universities in the North and West. They pursued degrees in engineering, medicine, law, education, and business. Their wartime experience had shown them what they could accomplish. Their education provided the tools to accomplish it. Captain Ivan Harrison, who commanded troops in the 761st, later became a physician. He attended medical school after the war, completed his residency, and practiced medicine for decades. His journey from tank commander to doctor exemplified the potential that emerged when barriers fell. Harrison's story repeated itself across the battalion. Men who might never have attended college in segregated America used their veteran benefits and demonstrated capabilities to build professional careers. Leonard Smith worked for the New York Transit Authority Police, rising to positions of responsibility. He served his community in uniform again, this time as a law enforcement officer rather as a soldier. His military experience prepared him well for this role. The discipline, the leadership training, the ability to function under pressure, all skills acquired in combat, served him throughout his civilian career. Countless other battalion veterans contributed to their communities, carrying pride in having served in a unit that changed history. They joined churches, civic organizations, veterans groups. They coached youth sports teams. They mentored young people. They served on school boards and city councils. They were engaged citizens who had earned their citizenship through service and demanded it be respected. Some became teachers, bringing military discipline and high expectations into their classrooms. They taught in segregated schools across the South, preparing the next generation of Black Americans for the opportunities they knew were coming. They taught in integrated schools in the North and West, demonstrating through their own achievements what Black Americans could accomplish. Their presence in these roles challenged stereotypes and opened minds. Others entered business, starting companies, creating jobs, building wealth in their communities. They applied skills learned in the Army, organizational ability, leadership, mechanical knowledge, to build successful enterprises. They proved that Black Americans could succeed in business just as they had succeeded in combat. Their success created economic opportunity for others and demonstrated pathways to prosperity. In 2005, the United States Army dedicated a monument to the 761st Tank Battalion at Fort Cavazos, Texas, formerly Fort Hood, where the battalion had trained. The monument features 4 black granite tablets surrounding a marble sculpture of a kneeling tanker. Surviving veterans attended the dedication ceremony, many in their 80s, some moving in wheelchairs, all carrying pride in what they had accomplished 6 decades earlier. The inscription honors their 183 consecutive days of combat without relief and their role in breaking Nazi racial ideology through demonstrated excellence. The 761st Tank Battalion proved through action what words alone could never accomplish. They showed that courage recognizes no color. That skill is earned through training, not inherited through race. That leadership emerges from character, not complexion. They fought 2 wars simultaneously, one against Nazi Germany across European battlefields, another against the assumption of Black inferiority that pervaded their own society. They won both through the same method, relentless excellence under impossible pressure. Every tank battle became evidence against racial prejudice. Every captured German position proved capability. Every day of continuous combat without relief testified to endurance and professionalism. Wehrmacht soldiers who had been taught that Black soldiers were inferior learned the truth in combat. German troops expecting easy victories against racially inferior opponents discovered instead determined, skilled, and courageous adversaries who outfought them repeatedly. When German prisoners expressed shock at being captured by Black tankers, they confronted the collapse of an ideology built on lies. When the 761st entered combat on November 7, 1944, they carried more than ammunition and fuel. They carried the hopes of millions of Black Americans wanting the chance to prove their worth. They carried the burden of representation, knowing their performance would be generalized to judge an entire race. They carried the weight of history, understanding their actions would shape military policy and civil rights progress for generations. They bore these burdens for 183 consecutive days of combat. They never faltered. They never broke. They never gave their enemies or their doubters any evidence to support racial theories. The Black Panthers of the 761st Tank Battalion proved that Nazi racial ideology was not just morally reprehensible, but factually wrong. In doing so, they helped dismantle similar prejudices within their own nation. Their legacy extends beyond European battlefields to the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. They demonstrated that when barriers fall and opportunity opens, excellence emerges regardless of race. That lesson, purchased with blood and courage across 183 days of unrelenting combat, remains their greatest victory.